Hello, I'm Ellen Bintz, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Hailsham, East Sussex in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's September 17th, 2025.
Now, in a recent episode, we spoke about the possibility of living in a multiverse or parallel universe. I love that episode. A domain in which one course of life is playing out while a completely different series of events is simultaneously happening in another realm. If we're honest, something that seems a very real prospect right on the doorstep of Ellen, not to mention elsewhere in the USA, gets us feeling that we're living in one of those parallel universes right now. And this is namely the threat of a major civil crisis that's facing one of America's biggest cities, Chicago. We know quite a number of our listeners live in and around that city as well, for whom this week's focus will be especially close to home. And as we recall, we've only recently learned that the National Guard are going into Memphis. So this is a very real.
Yeah. And when I say that I'm from Wheaton, Illinois, listeners might want to know that that's 30 miles west of Chicago. We are a suburb of Chicago.
Yeah. Kind of almost greater Chicago, I guess, almost.
Right. Yes.
And to be serious, this seems to us to be a direction in political and state control that should raise concern for all lovers of democracy and free speech. So in this episode, we're taking something of an editorial approach, as we sometimes do. In other words, we're being frank about what we believe, and not just hoping, but willing that the prospect of a state-controlled order that many Chicagoans fear will not come to be. At the same time, we'll aim to present the facts of what we know as objectively as possible, before coming back, as usual, to see where our intention and prayers might be needed.
So, what's the background to the threat of sending the National Guard into Chicago? Chicago is one of several Democratic-governed cities where President Donald Trump has called to deploy troops, allegedly as a necessity to combat crime and enhance federal immigration enforcement, despite local officials and data showing declining crime rates in these cities. Our Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson have both strongly opposed any such deployment, regarding it as unconstitutional, illegal, and politically motivated. They argue the action aims more to assert federal control and create political drama than to genuinely improve public safety. Trump has sought to portray Chicago as being dangerously violent and suggested that National Guard troops could support immigration operations and increased deportations, escalating tensions with local leaders who have rejected such measures. Legal challenges have also been mounted, particularly referencing the Posse Comitatus Act, which restricts military involvement in domestic law enforcement, with a recent federal judge ruling that a similar deployment in Los Angeles in June this year was unlawful. Illinois authorities and activists view the potential deployment as a threat to democracy and community safety rather than a legitimate security effort. And they are preparing to resist any action, both legally and through public protest.
The threat coincides with the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, who was shot, as I'm sure all listeners know, last Wednesday while speaking at an event at Utah Valley University. Several prominent figures have said that Americans are now at war or face a warlike situation in the wake of the shooting, while Trump himself wasted no time in naming what he said are the radical left as being behind the shooting and framing the moment as a dark, dark moment for America. Although at the time of this recording, the exact motives and background of the killer, who's in custody now, as we know, aren't known. Such war rhetoric is likely to further polarize already tense divisions among many Americans, stirring fear and adding a further sobering backdrop to the threat of a military presence in cities like Chicago. A fatal attack on a prominent Democrat also occurred in recent months when Minnesota House Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman and her husband were assassinated in their home back in June. Really quite appalling things going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. And the shooting of Charlie Kirk was tragic. And of course, we don't condone that. But here's my editorial comment. The unity has to start from the top down, and our country needs to concentrate on unity. And as I reflected on even both of the President Bushes, Barack Obama, Clinton, they would have come forth with a plea for unity among the
Yes.
people of our country.
Yes.
Both sides of the aisle would have done that in a very presidential way. And I'm missing that. And I think many of us in our country, no matter what side of the aisle you're on,
It's quite
are
striking, isn't it?
missing that.
How
Mm-hmm.
quickly it was turned upon to politicize, and
Mm-hmm.
even without, as we say, without many of the facts being known. Really
Mm-hmm.
very disturbing.
Right.
But not unusual in the current climate, in the current, particularly social media dominated agenda, really. Yeah, it's.
Well, what is disappointing, and the governor of Utah did come forth and talk about the need for unity, and this was one person who committed this act. This wasn't a whole radical left. It was one person. And he made some very powerful comments. However, on the Sunday morning shows, I don't know if you have those in the UK, Clive, but that go into deep dives.
Yep.
There were governors interviewed on both sides of the aisle, and the interviewer pointedly asked, "What do you feel about what President Trump said in the moment?" Immediately accusing the radical left, and no one would even say, "Well, in this moment, I feel like we need unity." They all said, "Well, he was angry," and kind of condoned his behavior, which was horribly disappointing to me and very surprising.
It is.
So we're looking for some leaders. We're looking for some people who will stand up and help us rise above this phenomenon.
So based on what we currently know, how probable is it that the threat will materialize? Based on current information, whether or not the threat to deploy the Guard in Chicago will happen is uncertain. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson are preparing legal and political resistance. And there's been no official communication from the federal government confirming imminent deployment. However, Vice President J.D. Vance said there are no immediate plans to send troops into Chicago, and recent signals suggest that Chicago might no longer be the primary focus of the White House National Guard's efforts. Although,
however, I think that has changed in the last few hours
it's the nature of this, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
It's not a question of what day it is, it's a question of what hour it is almost.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's certainly true the White House has maintained a strong rhetoric on deploying troops for immigration enforcement and crime control, with local authorities highlighting that actual troop deployment, while not yet confirmed, there's worry about immigration enforcement raids by ICE, that's the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, are ramping up in the city, although there's not been military intervention as of yet. But, as we say, many in the city and around are on tenterhooks about what may happen. And as we've seen, and I've just said time and again, what seems calm 1 minute can very quickly turn around.
My husband and I were in the city this weekend, and having breakfast on Sunday morning, somebody told us that the Mexican Pride Day was on Sunday, and they were gearing for possible ICE problems. And, it was suggested to us that we might want to head back to Wheaton sooner than later. As it turns out, when I read, about what actually happened, it was just a lower turnout. And much more calm event than it usually is, and talked about the fear that people are feeling. And it doesn't matter if you're legal or not. The ICE will still interrogate you and if you don't have your papers. So, yeah, there is definitely,
Very scary.
yeah.
Yeah.
hmm
And
Which is
that's
not.
going to add to an unease for everybody as well, isn't it? It's not just
hmm
yourself or a potential
hmm
target, but if you do anything that is seen as being controversial, shall we say, then there's a risk
Yes.
of being arrested. Top
Yes.
it up in one of those vans. Yeah.
There is quite a plan for different factions to make life a little bit more difficult, if I can say that, than it would be if the National Guard does come in. And there have been many National Guard members who have said, no, not going to do it. So it's controversial,
Yeah. Yeah.
definitely.
Mm.
So generally, in what circumstances might the National Guard be deployed in the US, and what precedents are there for this happening in the past? The National Guard is a reserve military force made up of mainly part time soldiers, and it can be deployed under several legal and constitutional circumstances, primarily governed by a mix of federal and state laws. It is generally under the authority of state governors responding to local emergencies such as natural disasters, civil unrest, and other state defined missions. But the President of the United States can place the Guard under federal control to respond to national emergencies, insurrections, invasions, and to enforce federal laws. This power is limited and regulated by Congress. Dot, 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 in theory.
Yeah.
The Insurrection Act of 1807 is the principal statute that allows the president to deploy active duty military forces or federalized National Guard troops to suppress insurrections or domestic violence when requested, when requested by a state governor or under special circumstances, such as failure of local law enforcement. And I heard Pritzker talk about this, and they said, are you going to call the president and say blah, 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 blah? And he said, no, I'm not, because he is going to turn that around and say, I called and asked for him to come in. He'll twist things. So I believe they're not communicating with each
Oh.
other, only through television, which he.
Though conversely, it's reported that the Tennessee governor was in agreement for troops coming to Memphis, as I understand.
Right.
It's a
Right.
different situation there, perhaps.
Yeah.
There's also what's called a Title 32 status, under which National Guard members operate under state authority but are federally funded and may perform certain federal missions. However, they remain under state control and aren't considered federal troops. And the Posse Comitatus Act, which we mentioned earlier, restricts the use of federal military forces in civilian law enforcement, except where Congress or the Constitution explicitly authorizes it. Now, there are several precedents for the National Guard being deployed, and these include disaster responses such as hurricanes and wildfires, where state governors have activated their National Guard, and civil disturbances, including the 1968 riots following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, during the 1992 Los Angeles riots, and more recently as a result of protests triggered by George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis 5 years ago.
The 2020 deployment of National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. to control protests following the murder of George Floyd and other social justice protests, and in recent weeks in that same city, was under a unique statutory interpretation since D.C.'s Guard reports directly to the president. The August order to deploy, which is still ongoing, was claimed necessary as a part of a federal crackdown on crime initiated by the president, but has, to say the least, been controversial. A deployment in Chicago would likely face stronger legal challenges unless the city or the state itself explicitly requests support, which it clearly hasn't in recent weeks.
It sounds like a real test for the current administration's desire or will, perhaps, to impose,
Yeah,
even contrary to the Constitution,
yeah,
this
yeah.
kind of control.
Exactly.
outside of
And
its area of authority, which clearly it has in Washington.
well, in both of these cities, the statistics, which often don't matter to this administration, have shown that the crime is decreasing.
Yeah.
They're on a good trend.
Don't worry about
There
law.
is crime. There's crime in every city. There's, these situations that they quote are anecdotal. It happens everywhere.
Mm.
And there's just, as I've read, there's so many other ways, so many other productive ways that assistance could be given to these cities instead of just coming in with brute force.
I don't know the data here, but I've always had a sense when I've been in DC that it's actually really quite a safe place. I felt, admittedly, it's not in recent times. I haven't been there for
Right.
several years, in fact. But
Yeah. Well, I was
really,
there in
very
May. I agree.
yeah,
Yeah.
walking around the mall and so on,
Hmm.
very at ease and relaxed, and crime doesn't
Hmm.
seem to be a problem
Hmm.
beyond the usual petty pickpocketing and so on. I guess that does go on.
Yeah. Well, you can find, like I said, you can find the crime in every city, and you can
Yeah.
find a story for every city where, this kind of thing happens, and the media is playing up to either side, whichever way they want to play this story.
Mm. Yeah. So, what is the official justification for the threat to move in troops, which is coming out of the White House? The White House is framing this threat as a response to combat violent crime, as we say, and also to support immigration enforcement efforts. President Trump has repeatedly characterized Chicago as being extremely dangerous, describing it as the worst and most dangerous city in the world. I would strongly dispute that, and
Hmm.
emphasizing a responsibility to restore safety. The White House argues that local Democratic leadership is unwilling or unable to handle crime effectively, and this is why federal intervention is required. A related justification involves supporting ICE operations in the city. The Federal Department of Homeland Security has reportedly requested logistical and operational assistance from the National Guard for immigration raids targeting undocumented immigrants, including facilities at Naval Station Great Lakes, which is near Chicago. I didn't know that. It's just
Hmm.
north, is it? Presumably.
Yes, just north. Hmm.
And this effort is linked to broader immigration enforcement and deportation actions. Despite these claims of rising violence by Trump, key city officials and crime data show significant crime reductions. Still, the White House insists that the deployment is about public safety and immigration law enforcement, not politics.
So, what do Chicagoans fear may happen if the threat is enacted? And what has been their response? Chicagoans fear that if the National Guard is sent into their city, it would lead to a militarized presence in their communities, increasing tensions rather than making for greater safety. Many worry that this would be a threat to civil liberties, lead to unnecessary confrontations, and exacerbate fears, especially among immigrant communities who have concerns about ICE raids and deportations, as I talked about before. Public opinion polls show a majority of Americans oppose the idea of National Guard troop deployments for domestic crime control, worrying about the effectiveness and consequences of such militarization. There's been a significant public outcry to the threat facing Chicago. Community leaders and residents have highlighted that federal enforcement actions create a climate of terror and cruelty, with several organizations distributing information on residents' rights to prepare for disruptions. I've seen several of these. There is also concern that this would negatively affect longstanding community efforts to reduce violence without involving heavy handed policing or military force. And as we've mentioned, responses from the state governor, local government, and the community have been strong in their resistance. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson has gone as far as to issue an executive order forbidding Chicago police cooperation with federal immigration or military enforcement actions. Meanwhile, community leaders have urged residents not to be intimidated and to stand up for their rights, and activists are mobilizing rights education and awareness campaigns, especially targeting immigrant neighborhoods. However, some community events, as I said, such as Mexican Independence Day Festival, they were postponed due to fears of disruption from ICE presence. I don't think it was postponed. I think it was just very subdued.
Really slimmed
Um,
down. Yeah.
mhm.
Mm.
People were a little nervous. And I've heard in other cities on this day, they held the events in a church inside instead of being on the streets or doing things. Or I think in some places it was postponed.
And this sort of thing just affects the whole energy of the place, doesn't it? That
Yeah.
people don't necessarily want to come into the center of a city and enjoy one. It's Grand Park is the main one, isn't it? In Chicago, a lovely
Mhm.
park.
Right.
Yeah, and going down by the where the museums are, Peninsula.
Well,
But
and I think as you've heard, that the initial claim was that he was going to deport criminals, and that hasn't always happened. There have been grandmothers and people who are legal and, people who are following the law to become legal, people with no history of crime at all who have been terrorized.
my goodness. And I
Mhm.
find it intriguing how this would all, if the National Guard is there and the police are not playing ball with them, essentially, how is that going to work in terms of
Right.
maintaining civil order?
Right.
We are willing that it won't happen, of course.
Mhm. Mhm.
Shouldn't jump the gun on that one. So, what did critics of the president make of the threat? Critics view the threat to deploy the National Guard troops as being politically motivated. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker calls it an unhinged move aimed at establishing a precedent for military intervention in democratic governed cities. I should say Democrat governed cities, shouldn't I? Ahead of the 2026 midterm elections, believing it to be a tactic to intimidate voters and manipulate electoral outcomes. And many critics argue that Trump's characterization of Chicago as being dangerously violent is false. As we've said, crime statistics showing that violence has actually declined significantly in recent years. They view the deployment threats as exacerbating division, fear, and distrust, especially among minority and immigrant communities who are targeted by the ICE actions. There is significant concern about militarizing policing and conflating immigration enforcement with crime control, which potentially might lead to civil rights violations and worsening community relations. So, where might we hone in then with our intention and prayers? And this is the point, as always, where you might want to put a bookmark in order to come back. We'll put a bookmark in the show notes as we invite you to join us in sending intention. And we'll mention a number of areas that came to us for holding intention in fairly quick succession. Again, you might want to pause after each. So let's just take a moment to allow ourselves to become very centered and present and connected, deeply grounded, feeling into the connection we have with the physical ground and allowing our attention to draw away from the mind to be very centered deep within the body. These are some intention, some suggested areas for intention that came to us. We will that President Trump and his advisors will be moved to recognize that deploying the National Guard for any political purpose will be both immoral and contrary to the unalienable rights of all American citizens.
And we ask that those who are calling out and preparing to stand up against any unconstitutional or illegal deployment of troops in the city will have wisdom in their actions and decisions.
We will that the media and social media influencers will be concerned to present facts rather than fiction about the background to the threat of deployment, and will be moved to not wittingly or otherwise cause mischief that might endanger security and undermine the trust of communities within the city.
We ask that all Chicagoans and their loved ones who fear what may happen in their city will be protected in light, reassured that they are held by any force greater than human force.
And we will that those who are seeking to educate and advise individuals who feel vulnerable to the threat of arrest, should the deployment happen, be wise in their counsel and to know where their attention might be directed to serve the highest good.
And this week, as Chicago braces itself for a possible uncertain period of civil unease, we suggest holding as our main intention And I ask our listeners, please, we will that wise heads will prevail in the White House among those who have the ear to advise the president on the real incidence of crime in Chicago and the wisdom or otherwise of deploying the National Guard into the city. Please join us in holding this intention.
That about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in my daily Insight Timer offerings and with Ellen in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us in holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime, thank you, go well, stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Binns and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.